At my daughter's lavish birthday party, in front of 150 wealthy guests, she suddenly slapped me so hard, the entire room fell silent. My hand-carved gift box slipped from my fingers and shattered across the marble floor, but she didn't even look at it. Instead, she called me trash. My son-in-law calmly threw a glass of red wine onto my chest, and security dragged me out of the mansion I once sacrificed everything to help them build. As the heavy doors slammed behind me and the rain poured down, I realized something chilling. The people celebrating inside had no idea whose life had truly paid for their luxury. I'm truly grateful you're here with me today. Before the story continues, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel and who is listening. Also, a quick note. Parts of this story include fictional elements for storytelling and reflection. Any similarity to real people or places is purely coincidental, but the message behind it is meaning and worth thinking about. I was 70 years old, completely broke, and standing alone in a room filled with people whose fortunes existed because of my sacrifice. Not one of them knew it. To them, I was just an old man in a cheap suit who had ruined a perfect evening. The security guards didn't hesitate. Their hands clamped around my arms and marched me across the marble floor. My worn shoes scraped against the polished stone, the same marble my money had helped pay for. Before I could say another word, they shoved me through the massive oak doors. I stumbled down the wide stone steps and crashed onto the driveway below. My knees slammed into the pavement, pain shooting up my legs as gravel bit into my skin. Behind me, the enormous doors slammed shut with a heavy boom, sealing off the warmth, the music, and the laughter inside. Outside, the night air felt brutally cold for Los Angeles. Within seconds, a hard rain began to fall, heavy drops striking the driveway like tiny hammers. The dark red wine soaking my shirt slowly ran down the fabric of my jacket, diluted by the rainwater until it looked like faded blood. For a long moment, I didn't move. I sat on the wet asphalt, trembling, staring up at the bright windows of the mansion. Through the glowing glass, I could see shadows moving, people laughing, raising their glasses, celebrating beneath chandeliers and soft music. They were celebrating the life I had built for them. My hands shook as the rain soaked through my clothes and chilled my bones. I truly believed that was the end of my story. I thought my life was over. I thought I might freeze to death on the driveway of the very house I secretly owned. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself off the ground. My joints protested as I stood. Rain plastered my gray hair against my forehead and ran down my face like tears. I turned away from the mansion and began walking down the long, winding driveway that led toward the main gate. Behind me, the $15 million estate glowed like a palace, but it might as well have belonged to another world. The cold wind sliced straight through my soaked jacket. I had nowhere to go, no money in my pockets, no family left to call. Every step felt heavier than the last as I walked down the dark road, the rain blurring my vision. My breath came in slow clouds in the freezing air. Minutes passed, maybe longer. In the darkness, it felt like hours. The only sound was the rain hitting the pavement and the distant hum of the city far below the hills. Then suddenly the darkness exploded with light. A pair of blinding headlights cut through the storm behind me. I heard the deep, powerful growl of an engine, low, expensive, unmistakably strong. Tires screeched on the wet pavement as a long, midnight black Bentley Mulsanne surged forward and swerved sideways, blocking the road in front of me. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a split second, I thought Calvin had sent someone to finish the humiliation, to drag me somewhere even darker. The heavy rear door of the Bentley opened slowly. A man stepped out into the pouring rain. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than everything I owned. In one hand, he held a large black umbrella shielding himself from the storm. He looked to be in his late 40s, tall and composed, his sharp eyes cold and calculating as they studied me through the rain. I had never seen him before. He walked closer, the umbrella casting a shadow across his face. His gaze moved from my soaked clothes to the wine stains on my chest, then to my shaking hands. Finally, he stopped a few feet away. "Get in the car, Mr. Doyle," he said calmly. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that demanded obedience. "It's time we crush them." I stood frozen in the freezing rain, staring at him as the words echoed in my ears. Crush them. The phrase hung in the wet air, fighting against the roar of the storm. Just 10 minutes earlier, my own daughter had slapped me and called me trash in front of the richest people in the city. My son-in-law had thrown wine on my chest and ordered security to throw me out like garbage. And now a stranger in a Bentley was offering me something I couldn't even understand yet. For a moment, my exhausted mind refused to process what was happening. I felt empty, broken, ready to accept whatever miserable fate waited for me somewhere on the dark streets of Calabasas. And now this stranger, a man who carried himself with the calm authority of immense wealth and power, stood in front of me offering something I had not expected, a way to fight back. For a moment I hesitated. Every instinct I had developed over 70 difficult years of life told me to be cautious. Men like this did not simply appear out of the rain to rescue broken strangers. And you certainly didn't climb into a midnight black Bentley with someone you had never met. Not in a place like Calabasas, where fortunes were built in daylight and buried secrets thrived in the dark. I studied his face carefully. His jaw was tight and controlled. His dark eyes held no trace of sympathy or pity. There was only calculation, cold and precise. Strangely, that was exactly what convinced me. I had lived with pity long enough. For 5 humiliating years, I had swallowed every ounce of it while living in Calvin's damp basement. I had endured the quiet looks, the dismissive sighs, the polite lies about how unfortunate my situation was. I didn't want pity anymore. I wanted justice, or maybe in that bleak moment standing in the rain, what I truly wanted was revenge. Without saying a word, I stepped toward the car. The stranger opened the heavy door wider and tilted the umbrella so the rain wouldn't hit my head. I lowered myself into the back seat. The contrast was overwhelming. The interior smelled of polished mahogany and expensive leather stitched by hand. Warm air wrapped around me, instantly thawing the deep chill that had settled into my bones. For a moment, I simply sat there, stunned by the comfort. As soon as my soaked legs were fully inside, the man shut the door with a solid, reassuring thud. The violent roar of the storm outside vanished instantly. Inside the cabin, the silence was complete, thick and insulated, like stepping inside a bank vault. A second later, the stranger entered from the opposite side, folding his umbrella with effortless precision. In front of us, separated by a dark pane of tinted glass, the driver smoothly shifted the car into gear. The Bentley began moving. Through the rear window, I watched the glowing lights of the $15 million mansion fade into the rain. My daughter's mansion. Or perhaps, as I would soon learn, not entirely hers. I sat awkwardly in the pristine seat, painfully aware of my appearance. My cheap suit was soaked through with rain and stained with red wine. The fabric clung to the luxurious cream leather beneath me. I felt like a stain inside a museum. But the stranger showed no sign of concern. He leaned forward and opened a concealed compartment inside the polished wooden console between us. From it, he removed a thick, heated towel and handed it to me. Then he poured a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a heavy glass tumbler. "Drink," he said calmly. "It will stop the shaking." My hands trembled slightly as I took the towel. I wiped the rain and wine from my face, feeling the warmth seep into my skin. Then I accepted the glass. I took a cautious sip. The scotch burned warmly down my throat, spreading heat through my chest, like a small, controlled fire. For the first time since the slap, I could breathe again. I drew in a slow breath, and finally found my voice. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. My voice sounded hoarse and fragile even to my own ears. "And why would someone like you pick up a worthless old man standing on the side of the road?" The man adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate suit. Gold cufflinks flashed briefly in the warm cabin light. Then he looked directly at me. His gaze was steady and unsettlingly calm. "My name is Victor Thorne," he said, "and you are far from worthless, Franklin. In fact, at this moment, you may be the most important man in Los Angeles. You simply don't realize it yet." I stared at him, confused. He knew my name, my full name. A sharp wave of anxiety passed through me. Was he a police officer, a private investigator, or worse, one of Calvin's corporate enemies trying to use me for leverage? "How do you know who I am?" I asked, sitting a little straighter. It was the first instinctive attempt to recover some dignity. "I've never seen you before. I'm a retired mechanic from Detroit. I have no money, no power. My own daughter just threw me out of her house tonight." I paused and took another small sip of the scotch. "If you're planning some kind of ransom," I continued bitterly, "you've got the wrong man. They wouldn't pay $1 to bring me back." Victor allowed himself a faint smile. There was no humor in it. He leaned back comfortably and folded his hands across his lap. "I know exactly what happened inside that house tonight, Franklin," he said. "I know about the wooden box you carved. I know about the slap your daughter gave you. I know Calvin threw wine on your jacket. And I know security dragged you out the front door like an unwanted stray." My stomach tightened. This man knew far too much. "I've been watching your son-in-law for a long time." A chill crawled down my spine, and this one had nothing to do with the rain. Victor spoke with quiet certainty, the kind of certainty possessed only by men who controlled powerful information. "You've been watching Calvin?" I asked slowly. Why I hesitated. "Are you a cop?" Victor's smile returned. This time it was colder. Much worse. He reached toward the console and picked up a silver tablet resting beside the decanter. "Open this." He handed the device to me. My hands still trembled slightly as I accepted it. The screen was already illuminated. Rows of financial records filled the display: bank transfers, corporate filings, legal documents, spreadsheets packed with numbers. My eyes scanned the screen helplessly. The information meant nothing to me. "I don't understand any of this," I admitted quietly. "I'm a mechanic. I fix engines. I don't read corporate balance sheets." Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was sharp, now focused, like a surgeon examining a patient. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings," he said calmly. "We're a private equity firm based in New York. Our specialty is aggressive acquisitions. We buy companies, dismantle them, liquidate their assets, and expose the debts their owners try to hide." He paused briefly. "In simple terms, Franklin, we destroy corporations that are built on lies." My grip tightened slightly on the tablet. Victor's voice remained steady. "And your son-in-law's empire," he continued, "is one of the most interesting lies we've encountered in years." I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how heavy the expensive scotch felt in my stomach. Why would a Wall Street billionaire care about a retired mechanic from Detroit? I asked, completely baffled. Victor didn't answer immediately. He watched the rain sliding down the dark window for a moment, before turning back toward me. "Because of what's inside that tablet, Franklin," he said quietly. 5 years ago, Calvin Carrington was a desperate man. His first 2 startups had collapsed. Investors had abandoned him. He was buried under debt and staring directly at personal bankruptcy. More than anything, he was terrified that your daughter would leave him the moment the money disappeared. The words struck a nerve so deep that I instinctively closed my eyes. Memories rushed back with painful clarity. Victor was right. I could still see that night in Detroit as if it had happened yesterday. It was a freezing evening in late November. Calvin had arrived unexpectedly at my modest house. My home wasn't much, just a small place with peeling paint and a garage attached, but it had been mine for decades. He sat at my old kitchen table, the one covered in scratches from years of tools and repair manuals. Then he buried his face in his hands, and he cried. Not politely, not quietly. He cried like a broken man who had reached the end of the road. He told me everything had collapsed. His companies were gone. His credit was destroyed. Investors had walked away. He said if he didn't find capital immediately, his career would be finished. I just need one last chance, he had said through tears. One more round of funding and this real estate tech platform will explode. I know it will. But he had one condition. He begged me not to tell Ashley. His voice had been filled with humiliation when he explained it. He said his pride couldn't survive the idea of his wife knowing her working-class father had rescued him financially. Ashley believed he was a brilliant, self-made entrepreneur, and he needed to preserve that illusion. If she finds out you bailed me out, he had said, she'll never look at me the same way again. And I, like a fool blinded by love, had agreed. I loved my daughter more than anything in the world. I wanted her marriage to survive. I wanted her to be happy. So I did what fathers do. I sacrificed everything. I went to the bank and emptied my retirement account. I sold the auto repair shop I had spent 40 years building from nothing. That garage had been my entire life's work. Every tool, every customer, every memory. Gone. When it was finished, I had exactly $500,000. 500,000. Every penny I owned in the world. I handed it to him, but because Calvin insisted the money remain hidden from Ashley, his lawyers created a blind trust. The funds were transferred into a corporate entity designed to keep my name completely off the official records. I signed the documents without hesitation. I wasn't investing. I was saving my daughter's marriage. And in doing so, I sacrificed everything to protect Calvin's fragile ego. Victor watched my face carefully as the memories surfaced. His eyes studied every flicker of regret and sorrow passing through me. You placed your entire life inside a blind trust, he said calmly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. You gave away your home, your retirement, and your financial security just to protect the pride of the man who threw you into the rain tonight. I lowered my gaze. Yes, I said quietly. My voice cracked under the weight of old shame. I thought I was helping my family. I stared down at my worn shoes resting on the spotless Bentley floor mat. But it didn't work out. My throat tightened as I repeated the story I had been told over and over for 5 years. The market turned bad not long after we created the trust, I said slowly. Calvin came to me months later looking completely devastated. He said the startup market collapsed. He said every investment he made with my money disappeared overnight. I swallowed painfully. He told me the entire $500,000 was gone. The words felt bitter even now, lost. I took a shaky breath. He said he felt terrible about it. I continued quietly. But he claimed another group of investors stepped in at the last minute to save the company. My money was gone, but at least the business survived. I paused. That's why I ended up living in their basement. The confession hung heavy in the car. Calvin said I could stay there out of kindness, I continued. He said he felt responsible for my situation. I had no house anymore, no business, no retirement. I laughed bitterly, so he gave me a small room next to the furnace, and I accepted it. Because I believed him. I believed I had destroyed my own future. I thought he was doing me a favor, I whispered, letting a foolish old man stay under his roof. Silence filled the Bentley. The engine hummed softly beneath us as the rain tapped against the windows. Victor didn't show a single trace of sympathy. Instead, something colder appeared in his expression. He leaned forward and tapped the tablet screen resting in my hands. A new document appeared instantly. It was a detailed bank statement from exactly 5 years ago. The numbers glowed sharply on the screen. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The figures told a completely different story from the one I had believed for half a decade. My heart began pounding violently against my ribs. A crushing wave of disbelief rolled through me as I stared at the data. "He didn't lose a single dollar," Franklin Victor said calmly. His voice sliced through the quiet cabin like a blade. "He lied to you." The words echoed in my mind. A lie. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't. I had seen the documents. I had watched Calvin pacing in my basement, pulling his hair out in despair as he described the market crash. I had watched him cry real tears while apologizing again and again. For 5 years I believed I had destroyed my own retirement, that I had gambled my future and lost. My throat tightened painfully as I gripped the tablet harder. My knuckles turned white. Victor reached over and gently removed the device from my shaking hands. Then he replaced it with something heavier. A thick manila folder. "Open it," he said. His tone left no room for hesitation. I slowly lifted the cover. Inside were dozens of printed documents, each stamped with official bank seals and federal registry markings. This wasn't speculation. This was proof. My eyes darted across the first page. It was a financial ledger from the exact month I transferred the $500,000. According to Calvin's story, that money had been invested in a startup that collapsed within weeks. But the document in front of me showed something entirely different. A wire transfer, directly from the blind trust, straight into a newly created corporate holding account. The money hadn't been lost. It had been preserved, carefully, strategically. Calvin had used my life savings as the founding capital for his real estate technology company. My hands trembled as I turned the page, and the next, and the next. Each document detailed the explosive growth of the company over the past 5 years. There were no other early investors, no miracle venture capitalists swooping in to rescue the business. Just one source of capital. Mine. Every office, every server, every luxury car, every mansion. Built from my $500,000. The realization struck me like a train moving at full speed. Calvin hadn't allowed me to stay in his basement out of kindness. He kept me there because it was the safest place to control me. He needed me isolated, poor, ashamed, ignorant. If I had stayed in Detroit, I might have started asking questions. But by keeping me under his roof, stripping away my dignity, and feeding me constant reminders of my supposed failure, he ensured I would never investigate the truth. The cruelty of it was staggering. For 5 years I had eaten his leftovers. I wore the same fading clothes until the fabric practically disintegrated. I apologized to him for taking up space in his home, all while he traveled on private jets, drank rare vintage wines, and bought Ashley $15 million mansions. With my money. Something deep inside me shifted. A quiet anger rose slowly from the depths of my chest. It wasn't explosive. It was colder than that. Sharper. A controlled fury that burned away every remaining trace of sadness. For the first time in years, my thoughts felt clear. I lifted my head and looked directly at Victor. My vision was steady now. "So he stole it," I said slowly. My voice sounded calm, far calmer than I felt, and strangely unfamiliar to my own ears. "He took my money, built an empire on top of it, and then legally erased me from the entire picture." Victor shook his head. A faint, predatory smile crept onto the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile a hunter might wear when he realizes the trap has already snapped shut. That, Victor said smoothly, is actually the most beautiful part of this entire situation, Franklin. I frowned, confused. Calvin Carrington is an incredibly arrogant man, Victor continued, but arrogance and intelligence are not the same thing. When he convinced you to create that blind trust 5 years ago, he made a critical mistake. He tried to save money. Victor leaned forward slightly, his tone almost amused. Instead of hiring a top-tier legal firm to draft a custom trust agreement, he used a standard legal template, something cheap, generic, and widely available. He thought he was being clever. In reality, he simply exposed his own ignorance. He tapped a finger lightly against the folder resting in my lap. You see, Calvin was so obsessed with keeping your involvement hidden from Ashley that he overlooked how the trust structure actually functioned. Victor paused before continuing. He appointed himself as managing director of the trust. That gave him complete operational control over the money. He could move the funds, invest them, build companies with them, whatever he wanted. Victor's smile sharpened. But operational control is not the same as ownership. He reached across the console and flipped the dossier open to its final page. His finger landed on a dense paragraph buried near the bottom of the document. "Read this clause," he said. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the legal language printed on the page. The text was thick with complex terminology, the kind of writing meant for lawyers, not mechanics. Victor spoke again, calmly translating the words. "When the trust was established, you were designated as the sole primary equity holder. That means the original investment, your $500,000, belonged entirely to you. Calvin was never granted ownership, only management." Victor tapped the paragraph again. "And since that $500,000 was the only capital used to incorporate the holding company that later became Calvin's empire, your equity stake rolled forward into every subsequent corporate structure." My mind struggled to keep up. Victor's voice remained steady. In simple terms, he said your ownership percentage grew alongside the company itself. As the business expanded, so did your equity. He leaned back into the shadows of the Bentley's leather seat. "You were never bought out. Calvin never had the personal capital necessary to purchase your shares, which means that, legally speaking," Victor let the sentence hang for a moment, "you still own the majority." I stared at him blankly. The words echoed through my mind, but they refused to fully settle. "I'm not sure I understand what you're saying," I murmured, though deep inside, something powerful was beginning to form, something impossible and terrifying. "What exactly does that mean for me?" Victor turned his head slightly and gestured toward the rain-streaked window. Through the glass, I could still see the distant glow of the Calabasas mansion we had just left behind. Its lights shimmered in the storm like a palace floating above the darkness. Victor pointed toward it. "It means," he said quietly, "that legally speaking, Mr. Doyle, you own 80% of everything." My breath caught in my throat. The company, the corporate accounts, the investment portfolios. His finger moved slightly, still pointing toward the distant mansion. And that house. The same mansion they just threw you out of. The words slammed into my mind like a hammer. 80%. I owned 80% of a multi-million-dollar empire. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. My thoughts scrambled desperately to make sense of the revelation. The damp basement room I had been sleeping in, the cheap clothes I wore, the leftovers I ate alone while the rest of the house entertained guests upstairs. It had all been a lie. Calvin wasn't my savior. I was his, and he had repaid that sacrifice by turning me into a ghost inside my own investment. I looked down at the thick folder resting in my lap. The weight of it suddenly felt enormous. Carefully, I began turning the pages. Victor had highlighted dozens of documents, corporate structures, tax filings, financial transfers. Each one traced the growth of Calvin's company step by step. My money had been the foundation. Every office building, every development project, every luxury purchase, all built from that initial $500,000. A deep wave of betrayal rolled through me. I continued flipping through the pages slowly. Then something caught my eye near the back of the folder, a single sheet of paper that didn't resemble the others. Unlike the financial reports and legal filings, this document was short and straightforward. Too straightforward. I carefully pulled it from the stack. The paper was crisp, official, a legal waiver. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the document closer to the warm cabin light. I began reading. Each sentence tightened the knot in my chest. It was a complete equity waiver, an unconditional transfer of ownership. The document stated that the primary shareholder, me, voluntarily relinquished all equity rights in the trust and transferred them directly to Calvin Carrington. All 80%. My breathing slowed. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page. There it was, my signature. Clear, undeniable, not forged, not faked. My handwriting, my pen, my consent. The air inside the Bentley suddenly felt thin. For several seconds I couldn't move. I simply stared at the page while my heart pounded violently in my chest. When had I signed this? The question repeated itself in my mind over and over again. I searched my memory frantically. Every meeting, every document, every signature. Then suddenly, the memory struck me like a punch to the ribs. My breath caught sharply as the realization exploded inside my mind. About a month earlier, Calvin had come down to the basement, carrying a thick stack of paperwork under his arm. I remember the moment clearly now, every detail returning with painful precision. That day he had been unusually friendly. He even brought me a hot cup of coffee, something he almost never did. His voice carried that casual, slightly impatient tone people use when dealing with annoying bureaucracy. He told me the company's health insurance provider required updated medical history forms for everyone listed as a dependent on his property. Apparently, the insurer was conducting routine compliance checks, and he had to gather signatures from anyone living under his roof. It's just pointless paperwork, he had muttered, rolling his eyes. Insurance companies love wasting everyone's time. He flipped through the documents, quickly tapping the bottom of each page with his finger and telling me exactly where to sign. I didn't question it. Why would I? Calvin had been handling all the financial matters in the household for years. To me, he was the successful businessman, the man who had graciously allowed me to stay in his home after my own foolish investment wiped out my retirement. I trusted him. I didn't bother reading the fine print. My eyesight had been getting worse lately, and the text on those forms had looked small and complicated. It seemed easier to simply do what he asked, so I signed, page after page, again and again, all the while believing I was simply helping my son-in-law deal with routine health insurance paperwork. Now, sitting inside the quiet luxury of the Bentley, I understood the truth. Calvin had slipped the equity waiver into the middle of those medical forms. He had hidden it there, deliberately burying it between harmless documents where I would never think to question it. He had used my trust as a weapon. He knew my eyesight was failing. He knew I wouldn't suspect anything when it came to insurance paperwork. And he knew that after 5 years of living under his roof, I would never imagine he was capable of something so cruel. The sheer level of cold, calculated malice behind that deception made my stomach twist. Calvin didn't just want me hidden away in the basement. He wanted the empire that had been unknowingly built on my money. And he planned to steal it legally, using my own signature, using my own pen. I stared down at the black ink scrawled across the bottom of the waiver. My name, my handwriting, my consent. A wave of humiliation washed through me, heavy and suffocating. For weeks, Calvin had smiled at me across the kitchen table. For weeks, he had tossed sarcastic comments my way, laughing quietly when I apologized for taking up space in his house. all the while knowing that the paperwork transferring everything to him was already signed. He had been waiting for the moment when the clock would run out. I traced the edge of the crisp paper with my thumb, bitterness rising in the back of my throat. Across from me, Victor watched silently. His dark eyes studied every change in my expression. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't offer comfort. And strangely, I was grateful for that. Comfort was useless now. What I needed was clarity. I lowered my gaze and examined the document again. My eyes stopped at the date printed near my signature. A cold chill ran through my body. The document had been signed 4 weeks ago, but the effective transfer date, the moment when the equity ownership would legally change, was listed clearly at the top of the page. Midnight. Tonight. My eyes widened. Suddenly, everything made sense. The lavish birthday party taking place inside the Calabasas mansion wasn't just a celebration for Ashley. It was a victory lap. Calvin had gathered the city's wealthiest investors, developers, and social elites under one roof because he knew something they didn't. By tomorrow morning, he believed he would officially own everything. The company, the assets, the mansion, all of it. Throwing me out tonight had been the final step. He didn't need to pretend anymore. He already had my signature. From his perspective, the game was over. He wanted me gone before midnight, gone before the legal transfer became permanent and irreversible. If I had walked away from that mansion tonight, if I had simply wandered down the road, found a cheap motel, and tried to sleep through the pain of my daughter calling me trash, then by sunrise, everything would be lost forever. Calvin would win. He would keep the empire built on my sacrifice, and I would die someday, as nothing more than a poor old mechanic who lost everything because he loved his family too much. I slowly lifted my head. Victor's cold gaze met mine. Something inside me changed in that moment. The sadness that had weighed down my chest for years suddenly evaporated. In its place came something else. Resolve. Burning and sharp. I inhaled slowly, steadying my breath as I gripped the document tightly in my weathered hands. The time for blind loyalty was over. The anger inside me didn't cloud my thinking. If anything, it sharpened it. For the first time in years, my mind felt clear. I carefully placed the waiver back inside the folder. Then I looked directly at Victor. "I understand what he did," I said quietly. My voice was steady. "He stole my money. He built a fortune on my sacrifice." I paused for a moment. "But that still doesn't explain you." I leaned back slightly in the leather seat. "Men like you don't drive through storms, picking up old mechanics out of kindness." My eyes stayed fixed on his. "So what's the real reason you're here?" Victor gave a small nod, almost approving. It seemed he had been waiting for that question. "We're not interested in your family drama, Franklin," he said calmly. His tone was professional and detached. "We care about numbers." He rested his arm along the console between us. 6 months ago, Vanguard Holdings identified Calvin Carrington's company as a potential acquisition target. He continued. On paper, his real estate technology empire looked extremely attractive. The financial reports showed impressive profit margins, rapid market growth, and a balance sheet that appeared almost flawless. Victor's lips curled slightly. We were prepared to offer him a very generous buyout. He paused briefly. "But before we invest a single dollar, we conduct our own investigation." He tapped the folder again. "Our forensic accountants examine everything. Every ledger, every tax return, every offshore account tied to the company. They specialize in finding what desperate men try to hide." Victor poured another small amount of scotch into his glass. The amber liquid swirled slowly under the cabin lights. "Calvin Carrington is a talented salesman," Victor continued. But he's a terrible businessman. He lifted the glass slightly. And he's an even worse gambler. Victor took a slow sip. Our accountants discovered something buried deep inside his finances. He tapped the folder once more. A hole. A very large one. He looked directly at me. Your son-in-law has been secretly funneling millions of dollars out of the company. Not into investments. Not into expansion. Victor's voice hardened slightly. Into underground poker games. High-stakes tables. Illegal ones. He shook his head slightly. Calvin believed he could beat the odds. Victor leaned forward. Instead, he buried himself. My throat tightened. How much, I asked quietly. Victor didn't hesitate. $10 million. The number hit me like a punch. 10 million. I struggled to process it. That much, I asked, my voice tightening. Who does he owe? I hesitated. To the banks. Victor raised the glass to his lips. Then he took a slow sip before answering. If he owed that money to legitimate banks, he would simply declare bankruptcy, restructure his assets, and begin again, Victor said calmly, his tone cold and matter-of-fact. But that isn't the case here, Franklin. The $10 million Calvin Carrington owes is not sitting on the books of any respectable financial institution. Victor paused, watching my reaction carefully. He owes it to a Russian syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. The words hung in the quiet cabin like a drop of poison. These are not businessmen who send polite legal notices when a payment is missed, Victor continued evenly. They are extremely organized, extremely violent men. When someone fails to pay them back, they don't negotiate through lawyers. He leaned back slightly, his voice lowering. They break legs. They burn houses. And sometimes, people disappear entirely. A chill ran down my spine. The image of Calvin, the arrogant, untouchable CEO who strutted around his mansion like a king, suddenly shifted in my mind. He wasn't a king. He was a trapped animal. Victor continued calmly. Calvin's final grace period ended this morning. The syndicate has already extended him more patience than most people ever receive. Now they want their money. His eyes hardened. And they don't particularly care how he gets it. The realization settled into my chest, like a block of ice. For the first time that night, I felt something almost close to pity for Calvin. Almost. But if he's buried under $10 million of debt, I said slowly, trying to piece the puzzle together, then how can he afford that party happening inside the mansion? I gestured vaguely toward the distant hills where the estate still stood glowing behind us. That celebration must cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, I continued. The imported food, the champagne, the musicians, the security detail. None of that makes sense if he's about to be hunted down by criminals. Victor's expression didn't change. Instead, a faint glimmer of approval appeared in his eyes. You're beginning to understand the situation, he said quietly. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. That party is not a birthday celebration. The statement was blunt. It's a smokescreen. He paused for emphasis. A very elaborate one. Victor gestured vaguely in the direction of the mansion. Calvin carefully invited some of the wealthiest tech investors in California tonight. Venture capitalists, private equity partners, startup founders, people who control massive amounts of capital. His voice remained calm. They all believe they're attending a glamorous social event. But the real purpose of tonight's gathering is entirely different. I felt my stomach tighten. He's pitching them something, I said slowly. Victor nodded. Yes. He's offering them a chance to buy a large share of his company. My pulse quickened. At a heavily discounted premium, Victor's lips curled slightly. On paper, the offer looks extremely attractive. He's presenting them with financial statements that show tremendous profit margins and explosive growth. Victor paused. But those financial statements are fake. The word landed like a hammer. He forged them. Victor tapped the folder resting on the console. Our forensic accountants already confirmed it. The records he's showing investors tonight have been carefully altered to hide the massive $10 million debt he owes to the syndicate. The knot in my stomach tightened further. So he's going to take their money, I said quietly. Victor nodded again. Exactly. He'll collect their investment capital tonight. His voice remained steady. Then he'll immediately use that money to pay off the Russian mob. I felt sick, and after that I asked. Victor didn't hesitate. After that, those investors will discover they've purchased shares in a company that's drowning in hidden debt. He leaned back again. They'll be left holding the empty bag. The scale of the deception hit me like a physical blow. Calvin wasn't just betraying me. He was preparing to rob dozens of wealthy investors at once and using the stolen money to save his own life. Victor continued calmly. My firm wants Calvin's technology. The software he developed has real value. It has potential. He paused briefly. But we will never purchase a company that is entangled with organized crime. His gaze sharpened. The only way Vanguard Holdings can acquire those assets is if the current structure collapses, and that means Calvin Carrington must be removed. The words settled heavily in the air. Removed. Victor reached inside his jacket pocket. He pulled out a device that looked nothing like an ordinary smartphone. It was thick, dark, and heavily reinforced with a matte metal frame and encrypted keypad. The device had the appearance of specialized hardware designed for secure communications. This is a satellite phone, Victor said calmly. It bypasses standard telecommunications networks. He turned the screen toward me. It connects directly to secure international banking systems. I noticed a number already dialed on the screen. Victor extended the phone toward me across the console. Take it. For a moment, I simply stared at the device. Then I reached out and accepted it. The phone was heavier than it looked. The metal casing felt solid in my rough, calloused hand. I pressed the green call button. The connection engaged immediately. For several seconds, there was nothing but the soft tapping of rain against the Bentley's thick, bulletproof windows. Then the line clicked. A voice answered instantly. The tone was calm, professional, and unmistakably European. You have reached the Private Client Executive Division of Geneva Central Banking Group, the voice said clearly. There was a brief pause. Please state your secure account identification code. I held the receiver against my ear, listening to the words. And for the first time that night, I realized something. Victor hadn't picked me up by accident. He had been preparing for this moment. For a long time. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing my mind to travel back exactly 5 years. The memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. When I first signed the legal documents establishing the blind trust, the cautious attorney overseeing the offshore transfer had insisted on implementing a failsafe. He had explained it carefully, emphasizing that moving $500,000 into an international corporate entity required a master override system. In case the managing director ever acts against the interests of the primary shareholder, he had said. At the time, I had considered the precaution unnecessary. Calvin had been family. I trusted him completely. Still, the lawyer had insisted. And so the system was created. My mind, trained through decades of mechanical work, to remember thousands of engine specifications, torque values, and part numbers, had memorized the security sequence perfectly. The long string of letters and numbers surfaced effortlessly. I am calling to initiate a complete master override on the Carrington Holding Trust, I said calmly into the satellite phone. My voice was steady. The primary account identifier is Delta 7 Tango 9 Echo 442. There was a brief pause. Then I heard the rapid clicking of keys on the other end of the line. "I can locate the trust within our international registry," the banker replied carefully. His voice carried the precise tone of someone trained to manage enormous sums of money. "However, this account is currently under the management authority of a registered corporate director. To override that authority, we must confirm the identity of the primary equity holder through our multi-tier authentication protocol." "Proceed," I said quietly. I stared straight ahead at the dark leather partition separating us from the driver. "I am ready," the banker began. "What was the make, model, and year of the first vehicle you personally restored?" The question didn't slow me down for even a second. "A 1968 Chevrolet Camaro Supersport," I answered immediately. "Painted tuxedo black." There was a pause. "Correct," the banker said. The clicking of keys continued. "Next question. What was the maiden name of the woman you married in the winter of 1972? For a brief moment, a sharp ache touched my chest. "My wife." The memory of her smile flashed across my mind, but I pushed the emotion aside. "Doyle," I said firmly. "Her maiden name was Doyle. We had the same last name before we even met." The typing continued. "That answer is verified." The banker's voice remained calm. "Now we will proceed to the final authentication layer." My grip tightened slightly around the satellite phone. "To authorize a global freeze on a corporate entity of this scale," the banker continued, "the primary equity holder must provide the master security passphrase established during the creation of the trust." I drew in a slow breath. Outside, the Bentley rain continued to strike the glass in steady rhythms. Across from me, Victor remained silent. His eyes watched me, carefully measuring every movement. He understood exactly what was happening. The power I held in my hands was enormous. 5 years earlier, when I chose the passphrase, I had done it for a simple reason. I wanted Calvin to remember where his salvation had truly come from, even if my name never appeared in the official documents. "The master passphrase is rust and ruined iron," I said clearly. I made sure every word carried through the encrypted connection. Rust and ruined iron. The line went silent. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. I could hear the faint digital hum of the satellite signal transmitting my voice across the ocean. My heartbeat remained steady. Something inside me had changed tonight. I was no longer the broken old man sitting on a driveway in the rain. I was the man who had built the empire, and I was finally reclaiming it. The banker returned to the line. His voice sounded exactly the same as before, calm, professional, unemotional. But now there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "Voice verification complete, Mr. Doyle." A brief pause followed. "All corporate and personal financial accounts connected to Calvin Carrington are now frozen." The words settled into the quiet cabin like the final strike of a judge's gavel. It was done. 5 years of deception had ended in a single phone call. I slowly lowered the satellite phone. The click as it disconnected sounded louder than I expected. For a moment I simply sat there, absorbing the reality of what had just happened. Calvin's empire, his company accounts, his investments, his personal assets had all been locked down. The financial lifeblood of his operation had been cut off completely. I handed the phone back to Victor. He accepted it with a small, satisfied nod and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The heavy silence inside the Bentley carried its own meaning. Somewhere in the hills behind us, Calvin Carrington was still celebrating. He was probably standing in the middle of his luxurious party, raising a glass of champagne, smiling at wealthy investors who believed they were about to secure a profitable opportunity. He had no idea what had just happened. The empire he thought he controlled had just been locked down by the man he had thrown into the rain. Victor reached for the tablet resting on the console. His fingers moved quickly across the screen. A secure application opened, displaying a grid of video feeds. Security cameras? Victor turned the tablet toward me. "Let's watch what happens next," he said quietly. On the screen, the grand foyer of the Calabasas mansion appeared. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Elegant guests mingled across the marble floor, holding glasses of champagne and speaking in animated conversations. In the center of the room stood Calvin, perfectly dressed, confident, smiling as he addressed a small circle of investors. He looked exactly like the successful entrepreneur everyone believed him to be, but now I knew something none of them did. Within minutes, Calvin Carrington's world was going to collapse. My eyes narrowed as I focused on the tablet in Victor's hand. The image displayed on the screen sharpened into perfect clarity, and it quickly became obvious that what I was looking at was not some simple digital map. It was a live feed, a high-definition broadcast streaming directly from inside the Calabasas mansion. For a moment, I simply stared. "Vanguard Holdings doesn't only freeze bank accounts," Franklin Victor explained calmly. His voice carried the steady, almost mechanical confidence of a man who had executed operations like this many times before. "About 10 minutes ago, my intelligence team gained administrative control of Calvin's smart home network." He gestured casually toward the screen. "That means we now control everything connected to it. Every security camera, every electronic door lock, every light system, and every alarm in the house." I leaned closer without realizing it, my attention completely absorbed by the unfolding scene. The camera feed swept across the enormous foyer and into the grand ballroom of the mansion. The party was in full swing. More than 150 of the wealthiest people in California filled the space beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. Their voices blended together into a hum of laughter and conversation as they moved through the room in elegant clusters. Waiters dressed in spotless white tuxedos moved gracefully between guests, balancing silver trays loaded with delicate appetizers and glasses of champagne. The atmosphere radiated wealth, power, privilege. And right there in the center of it all stood Calvin. He looked exactly as he always did when he wanted to impress people perfectly. Tailored tuxedo, confident posture, glass of vintage wine swirling lazily in his hand. He stood surrounded by a small group of older men in expensive suits. Private investors. I recognized them instantly. These were the men he planned to deceive. Calvin smiled broadly, speaking with animated charm, clearly enjoying the attention of his audience. From the outside, he looked like a man completely in control of his empire. Confident, untouchable, a king holding court. He had no idea that only minutes earlier the financial ground beneath his polished Italian shoes had disappeared. As I watched the performance, another figure entered the frame of the camera. It was the head caterer. The man wore a dark suit and carried a small digital payment terminal in one hand. His movements were cautious, almost nervous, as he approached Calvin. He waited politely until there was a small break in the conversation before leaning slightly forward and whispering something into Calvin's ear. I couldn't hear the audio, but I already knew what was happening. Victor touched the screen and expanded that specific camera feed. The image zoomed in until Calvin and the caterer filled the entire display. "The catering company requires final payment before serving the main course," Victor said calmly, narrating the moment like a chess commentator observing a match. $50,000 for the imported caviar and vintage champagne. He paused slightly. "They don't extend credit." Calvin rolled his eyes in irritation. The interruption clearly annoyed him. Still, he recovered instantly, offering the investors around him an easy, confident smile before excusing himself for a moment. Then he reached smoothly into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. From it, he pulled a sleek black metal credit card, an American Express Centurion card. The kind of card only issued to individuals with extraordinary wealth. To most people, it was a symbol of limitless spending power. Calvin didn't even glance at the caterer as he handed it over. The gesture was casual, dismissive, as if $50,000 was nothing more than pocket change. The caterer accepted the card respectfully and inserted it into the payment terminal. His fingers moved quickly across the keypad as he entered the charge. $50,000. Then he waited. Several seconds passed. The caterer's expression shifted. His brow furrowed slightly as he stared down at the screen. He removed the card, wiped the chip against the sleeve of his jacket, and tried again. Calvin noticed the delay. His charming smile faded slightly. He leaned closer to the caterer, speaking quietly but with visible impatience. The caterer shook his head. Then he turned the payment terminal around, so Calvin could see the display. Even without audio, the message was unmistakable. Declined. A cold wave of satisfaction tightened in my chest. The first domino had fallen. Calvin's reaction was immediate. He grabbed the black card from the caterer's hand, his face flushing red with sudden embarrassment. Around him, the investors continued chatting among themselves, though several had begun watching the exchange with mild curiosity. Calvin quickly opened his wallet. From it, he pulled a second card, a platinum corporate credit card linked directly to his real estate holding company. His movements were no longer smooth. They were tense, sharp. He handed the second card to the caterer while glancing nervously back at the investors. The caterer ran the card. The machine processed the payment request. 1 second, 2, 3, 5 long seconds passed. Then the red light flashed again. Declined. Calvin stared at the terminal as if it had betrayed him. For a moment, he didn't move. The confident businessman, who had been charming investors moments earlier, suddenly looked frozen. The arrogance, the swagger, the illusion of power. All of it evaporated in a single instant. Calvin quickly pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking now. Victor slid his finger across the tablet screen again. The camera feed zoomed in, further focusing on the glowing display of Calvin's smartphone. A flood of notifications appeared on the screen. Alerts, warnings, account suspended, corporate access denied, assets frozen. Message after message stacked across the screen in rapid succession. Every financial institution Calvin relied on had just cut him off. His empire, his accounts, his companies, his personal credit had all been locked down at the same moment. Calvin's face drained of color. The blood vanished from his cheeks until his skin looked almost ghostly under the chandelier lights. His breathing became shallow and uneven as the realization began to settle in. For the first time that night, Calvin Carrington looked exactly like what he truly was. A man whose world had just collapsed. But the nightmare unfolding inside that mansion was only just beginning. As Calvin stared at the frozen bank alerts flashing across his phone, another notification suddenly appeared at the top of the screen. It arrived silently, sliding into place above the financial warnings like the final nail in a coffin. It was an encrypted text message. The sender's number was unknown, yet the words displayed on the glowing screen were chillingly clear. Time is up. We are coming to collect. Calvin froze. The security camera captured every detail in sharp, unforgiving clarity. His eyes widened as he read the message, and for a moment, it seemed as though the air had been ripped straight from his lungs. That short sentence hung there like a death warrant. The Russian syndicate had made their move. I watched as his chest began rising and falling rapidly, his breathing uneven and panicked. The man who had looked so polished and untouchable only minutes earlier suddenly seemed smaller, weaker. His perfectly tailored tuxedo, once a symbol of wealth and control, now looked like a costume worn by someone who had forgotten his lines. Calvin shoved the phone back into his pocket with trembling fingers. Then he began scanning the ballroom. His eyes darted toward the front entrance of the mansion, searching the massive oak doors, as though expecting them to burst open at any second. He understood exactly what the message meant. The men he owed $10 million to were no longer waiting. They were coming, and they were coming now. Watching him unravel stirred a deep, quiet sense of justice inside me. For years he had treated me like a worthless burden. Now the mask was cracking. For the first time, Calvin Carrington looked truly afraid. But just as I allowed myself a small moment of grim satisfaction, Victor suddenly reached forward and pressed a button on the side of the tablet. The screen went black instantly. The live broadcast vanished. The glowing ballroom, the terrified man in the center of it, the entire unfolding collapse, all of it disappeared in a single second. The Bentley's interior lights reflected off the dark screen as silence filled the cabin once again. I turned toward Victor, confused. "Why did you turn it off?" I asked sharply. "I want to see what happens when those men walk through his doors." Victor remained calm. He poured the final drop of scotch into his glass before answering. "Watching him panic is satisfying," he admitted. "But entertainment isn't why we're here tonight." He took a slow sip. "Our objective is much larger than humiliating Calvin Carrington." Victor set the glass down carefully on the console. "His finances are destroyed. His corporate accounts are frozen. He can't steal money from those investors anymore." He paused slightly. "And the Russian syndicate will deal with the rest of his problems soon enough." Victor leaned back against the leather seat. "But we are dealing with a man who built his career manipulating systems and rewriting narratives." His gaze met mine. "And right now, Calvin is a cornered animal." He let the words settle. "Cornered animals are dangerous." I shifted slightly in my seat, the cold dampness of my soaked suit pressing uncomfortably against my skin. "If we drive away tonight," Victor continued, "and leave him to face the consequences alone, we leave one very serious loophole open." I frowned. "What loophole?" I gestured toward the folder resting on the console. "I froze every corporate account he has. I used the master override. His empire is finished." Victor shook his head slowly. "Financial destruction is not the same as legal justice." His voice was calm but firm. "Right now, Calvin Carrington is broke. Completely broke." He paused. "But tomorrow morning the police will get involved." Victor leaned forward slightly. "And when that happens, Calvin will immediately hire the most aggressive defense attorneys money can buy." He watched my reaction carefully. "Those lawyers will look at the account freeze you initiated tonight and claim it was a misunderstanding." I felt my stomach tighten. "They will argue that you, an elderly man with deteriorating memory, became confused and accidentally triggered the override." Victor's tone remained analytical. "They will claim you misunderstood the legal structure of the trust." My jaw tightened. "And they will present the document you signed last month. The equity waiver." Victor continued. "They will argue that you voluntarily surrendered your 80% ownership stake, and that you are now nothing more than an angry father-in-law trying to sabotage a successful entrepreneur." The words made my chest burn. "They will twist the entire story," Victor said calmly. "They will claim Calvin never forged anything, and without hard evidence, federal prosecutors will have nothing to charge him with." The reality hit me like cold water. Calvin had always been a master manipulator. Even now, with criminals hunting him and his finances destroyed, he might still escape. If he avoided prison, he would simply rebuild somewhere else and continue doing exactly what he had always done. "What do we need?" I asked quietly. My voice carried a sharper edge now. "What evidence will put him behind bars permanently?" Victor placed his glass down. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation will require the original trust contract." He spoke with precise clarity. "The physical document. The one you signed 5 years ago." Victor tapped the folder gently. "We need the original paper containing the wet ink signatures." He paused. "That document proves the structure of the trust. It proves that the equity waiver Calvin slipped into those medical forms contradicts the original legal charter. Victor looked directly at me. A digital copy will not survive the courtroom. His attorneys will tear it apart. But the original contract. He allowed himself a thin smile. That will destroy him. I closed my eyes. My mind traveled back to that day 5 years earlier. I had trusted Calvin with my investment, but I hadn't been foolish enough to leave something that important lying around inside his house. I still have it, I said quietly. I opened my eyes again. I placed the original contract inside a secure safety deposit box. Victor leaned slightly forward, where a private vault facility in downtown Los Angeles. I spoke slowly. No one else knows it exists, and no one else has the authority to access it. Victor nodded once. Excellent. His voice sharpened with renewed purpose. Then we retrieve it immediately. He gestured toward the dark highway ahead of us. We collect the contract, and we deliver it directly to my contacts inside the Federal Bureau. Victor's eyes held mine. Once the FBI has that document, Calvin Carrington will never see freedom again. He paused briefly. Do you have the key to the vault with you? The question hung in the air. For a moment I didn't answer. Instead, a sickening realization began forming in my stomach. My mind flashed back to the mansion, the grand foyer, the shattered wooden box lying on the marble floor, and the small titanium key that had fallen from my trembling hands. I clearly saw my daughter standing there in her incredibly expensive gown. I saw the look of disgust on her face. Then I saw the small hand-carved oak box slipping from my fingers, hitting the marble floor and splintering into pieces. I turned my head, looking through the rain-streaked window of the Bentley, staring back up the long driveway toward the mansion. The realization was crushing. It is in a safety deposit box. I whispered, my voice shaking as the horrifying truth settled over me, and the only titanium key to open it was inside the hand-carved wooden box my daughter just kicked into the mud. Victor stared at me, his cold, calculating eyes widening just a fraction of an inch as my horrifying words hung in the heavy air of the cabin. The absolute silence inside the luxury vehicle suddenly felt suffocating. He slowly placed the heavy crystal glass down onto the polished mahogany console, the soft clink echoing like a gunshot in the enclosed space. A small titanium key. Victor repeated, his voice low and incredibly sharp. You are telling me that the only physical access to the master trust document, the single piece of evidence that can successfully put Calvin Carrington in federal prison and save my corporate acquisition, was just kicked out into the pouring rain by a spoiled 35-year-old woman? I nodded slowly, a bitter taste rising in the back of my dry throat. Yes, I whispered, staring out the tinted window at the dark, winding road behind us. I spent 3 entire months carefully carving that small oak box. I wanted to give her something deeply personal for her birthday. I placed the titanium vault key securely inside, resting it on a small piece of velvet. When I tried to hand it to her in the grand foyer, she slapped me. The box fell shattered on the hard marble floor. And when Calvin ordered his security guards to violently drag me out of the house, I saw one of the waiters kick the broken pieces of wood straight out the front doors. It is sitting out there in the freezing mud, completely exposed to the elements. Victor cursed under his breath, a rare break in his otherwise flawless professional armor. He reached forward and grabbed the glowing tablet, his fingers flying rapidly across the smooth glass screen as he frantically switched back to the live security camera feeds. He bypassed the interior cameras monitoring the chaotic ballroom and quickly pulled up the exterior perimeter surveillance network. The high-definition screen illuminated the massive front gates and the sprawling circular driveway of the Calabasas estate. The heavy rain was washing down in thick gray sheets, turning the immaculate landscaping into a dark, muddy swamp. We stared intensely at the glowing screen, desperately searching the wet pavement for any sign of the splintered oak box or the shining metal key. But the driveway was massive, and the heavy storm severely limited the camera visibility. "We cannot just leave it out there," I said, my heart beginning to race with a sudden terrifying panic. "If Calvin manages to somehow survive tonight, if he finds a way to delay the Russian syndicate, he will eventually figure out that the digital freeze came from me. He will go looking for the original documents." Victor shook his head, his jaw clenching tightly. "It is much worse than that, Franklin," he replied grimly. "Look at the lower right corner of the video feed." I squinted at the small screen. Through the heavy curtain of freezing rain, I could clearly see two men wearing dark raincoats, pushing a large, heavy-duty industrial trash cart along the edge of the driveway. They were members of the private estate groundskeeping staff. Calvin is a relentless perfectionist when it comes to his public image. Victor explained, his voice filled with a sudden urgent tension. He pays a dedicated crew to constantly patrol the exterior of his property during major social events. They sweep up dropped napkins, cigarette butts, and any debris that might offend his wealthy guests. They are actively cleaning the driveway right now. I watched in absolute horror as one of the groundskeepers pushed a wide broom across the wet asphalt, pushing a large pile of wet leaves, mud, and debris directly toward the massive plastic trash cart. "If they sweep up the pieces of your wooden box," Victor continued, his tone turning deadly serious, "they will dump it directly into the commercial incinerator located behind the guest house. The estate burns all of its event refuge to maintain high security protocols. If that titanium key goes into the roaring fire, it will melt down into an unrecognizable piece of slag. The evidence will be gone forever, and your son-in-law will walk entirely free." The incredibly high stakes suddenly hit the ceiling of the luxury car. Everything we had just accomplished, the frozen bank accounts, the locked corporate assets, the brilliant digital ambush, it would all be completely meaningless if Calvin could simply claim his forged medical waiver was the only surviving legal document. He would spin a tragic story to the federal judges. He would easily manipulate the entire justice system, keeping his stolen millions and leaving me to die alone with absolutely nothing. The thought of him smiling in a courtroom, wearing his expensive suits, while I watched my entire life vanish into smoke, ignited a powerful blazing fire deep within my chest. I was completely done being the victim. I was done hiding in the shadows of my own stolen wealth. I reached out and gently pushed the silver tablet down, turning it away from Victor. I looked at the powerful Wall Street billionaire sitting across from me. He was waiting for my reaction, quietly calculating whether the broken old mechanic had the real strength to finish the brutal war we had just started. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold, damp fabric of my ruined clothes clinging to my tired skin. But I did not feel weak anymore. I felt an incredible, overwhelming surge of clarity and total resolve. I turned my head and looked directly at the thick, soundproof glass partition separating us from the professional driver in the front seat. "Turn the massive car completely around right now," I commanded, my voice booming through the quiet cabin with a startling, undeniable authority. Victor raised an eyebrow, a faint, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He pressed a silver button, relaying my strict order. I slowly buttoned up my wine-stained jacket. "We are crashing the party." The massive tires of the midnight black Bentley squealed violently against the wet asphalt as the professional driver expertly executed a sharp, aggressive turn right in the middle of the dark road. The powerful engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that perfectly matched the newfound fury burning intensely inside my chest. I sat back against the pristine leather seat, my hands resting steadily on my knees. I was no longer shaking from the freezing cold or the bitter sting of my daughter's cruel betrayal. Every single trace of fear and hesitation had been entirely burned away, leaving behind only a cold, hardened resolve. We were heading back into the belly of the beast. The heavy rain continued to batter the thick windshield, but the luxury vehicle sliced through the raging storm with effortless grace. Victor sat silently across from me, his dark eyes fixed intently on the glowing tablet in his lap as he monitored the live security feeds of the estate. The winding road that led back up into the exclusive hills of Calabasas passed by in a blur of shadowy trees and glowing street lamps. Within minutes, the towering, heavily fortified front entrance of the 15 million mansion finally came into clear view. Under normal circumstances, visitors were required to stop at a highly secure intercom system, state their business, and wait for the heavy wrought iron gates to slowly swing open. Tonight, however, Calvin had ordered his staff to leave the massive metal gates wide open to accommodate the steady flow of wealthy investors and luxury vehicles. In place of the closed gates, the estate groundskeepers had set up an elaborate, expensive barricade of towering floral arrangements, velvet ropes, and temporary valet stands to create a grand, welcoming entrance for the exclusive birthday party. 2 security guards wearing bright yellow raincoats were standing right in the middle of the entrance, holding glowing traffic wands to direct the arriving guests. I expected the professional driver of our Bentley to gradually slow down to pull up to the valet stand and allow us to exit the vehicle like civilized men. But Victor had given a very different set of instructions through his secure earpiece. The massive luxury car did not slow down even a fraction of an inch. Instead, the driver pressed his heavy foot firmly down onto the accelerator pedal. The engine surged with terrifying power. The 2 security guards standing by the velvet ropes widened their eyes in absolute panic, diving frantically out of the way just as the heavy, armored front grille of the Bentley violently plowed directly into the expensive floral barricade. The impact was incredibly loud. Thick wooden trellises snapped like dry twigs. Hundreds of perfectly arranged white roses and expensive orchids were violently launched into the dark, rainy sky. The heavy velvet ropes tore entirely free from their solid brass stanchions, whipping wildly through the freezing cold air. The Bentley completely obliterated the beautiful, welcoming entrance, leaving a massive trail of crushed flowers and broken wood in its violent wake. We barreled aggressively up the long, winding circular driveway, the wide tires throwing up massive waves of muddy water. The car finally skidded to a sudden, violently abrupt halt, right in front of the grand marble steps of the main entrance, completely blocking the path of a pristine silver Ferrari that belonged to one of the terrified tech investors. Total chaos immediately erupted outside the thick, soundproof windows of our vehicle. The loud, aggressive crash had instantly alerted Calvin's entire private security detail. Within seconds, more than a dozen large men wearing matching dark suits swarmed out from the shadows of the expansive property. They surrounded the midnight black Bentley, their faces twisted into expressions of aggressive, highly trained hostility. Several of them reached aggressively beneath their suit jackets, their hands resting menacingly on the hidden weapons securely fastened at their hips. The head of the security detail, a towering, muscular man with a thick beard, marched aggressively toward the side of our vehicle, clearly preparing to violently rip the doors open and drag us out into the freezing rain. I felt a brief, sudden spike of adrenaline pump rapidly through my veins. We were completely surrounded by hostile forces. But Victor Thorne simply smiled, a cold, predatory smirk that radiated absolute terrifying control. He calmly reached over and pressed a small silver button on the polished center console. The heavy locks on the Bentley disengaged with a solid, satisfying click. Immediately, the doors of the 2 large black sport utility vehicles that had been quietly trailing behind us the entire time swung wide open. 8 of Victor's elite, highly trained private bodyguards stepped out into the pouring rain. They did not shout. They did not wave their hands. They simply moved with absolute terrifying precision, forming a tight, impenetrable wall of solid muscle and dark suits entirely around our targeted luxury vehicle. The head of Calvin's security detail stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting nervously between Victor's massive men. Victor slowly pressed another button, rolling down his tinted passenger window just a few short inches. The freezing rain immediately blew into the warm cabin, carrying the loud, chaotic sounds of the shouting guards. The head of Calvin's security leaned down, his face flushed with extreme anger, ready to scream at the occupants of the luxury car. But the very moment his angry eyes met Victor's cold, calculating gaze through the narrow opening of the window, all the blood instantly drained right out of his flushed face. Victor spoke very quietly. "Good evening, Marcus. I trust the funds cleared without complications." The massive security chief instantly deflated. He pulled his hand away from his weapon. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," Marcus replied, betraying Calvin. "Stand down," he shouted to his confused men, waving them back. Marcus respectfully pulled our heavy door wide open. Flanked by men in black, I stepped out, entering the front doors I was just thrown out of. The moment I stepped through those massive oak doors, the atmosphere inside the grand foyer shifted violently. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. The elegant chatter of wealthy socialites died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Every single pair of eyes in that massive, high-vaulted room turned to stare at the wine-soaked old man who had just been violently thrown into the freezing rain less than an hour ago. I walked slowly across the imported Italian marble floor, my worn-out shoes leaving faint, wet tracks behind me. Victor Thorne followed silently at my right shoulder, flanked by his 8 elite bodyguards. We moved like a military formation, cutting through enemy territory. Calvin was standing near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a small circle of wealthy tech investors. He was in the middle of delivering what was clearly a desperate sales pitch, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to convince them to sign his fraudulent contracts. The moment he saw me walking toward him, his face went completely pale. The gold-plated pen he was holding slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany table. "What are you doing here?" Calvin stammered, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. "Marcus, where the hell is my security?" The head of security stood silently near the entrance, his arms crossed, making absolutely no move to intervene. I stopped directly in front of Calvin, standing so close I could see the beads of cold sweat forming on his pale forehead. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "I am here to reclaim what is mine," I said quietly, my words carrying across the dead silent ballroom with perfect clarity. Calvin's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked desperately at the wealthy investors standing around him, silently begging them to support him to validate his version of reality. But the older man standing closest to the table, a silver-haired billionaire whose face I recognized from magazine covers, took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating distance between himself and the disgraced chief executive. "Victor Thorne," the silver-haired man whispered, his voice barely audible. The older man's whisper of his name rippled quickly through the immediate circle of wealthy investors, carrying a distinct tone of fearful reverence that completely changed the atmosphere of the room. Calvin, still visibly shaking from his highly unprofessional outburst, finally turned his attention away from my wine-stained shirt. He followed the terrified gaze of the silver-haired billionaire, and finally noticed the imposing figure standing silently in the dark shadows behind my right shoulder. The transformation in Calvin's demeanor was instantaneous and entirely sickening to witness. The bright red flush of pure anger rapidly drained from his sweaty face, completely replaced by a pale, greedy hunger. He instantly recognized the powerful man. Every ambitious tech executive in the entire country knew the legendary chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. Calvin's panicked mind, completely unaware of the massive trap tightly closing around his throat, wildly misinterpreted the entire situation. He actually believed Victor Thorne had crashed this private birthday party to swoop in and make a massive last-minute investment in his struggling company. Calvin quickly smoothed the damp lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo, desperately trying to regain his shattered composure. He forced a wide, charming smile onto his face, completely ignoring my presence, as if I were nothing more than a piece of ruined furniture standing in his way. He stepped around the polished mahogany table, extending his hand enthusiastically toward the Wall Street titan. "Mr. Thorne," Calvin exclaimed, his voice dripping with absolute nauseating reverence. "What an incredible honor it is to have you here tonight in my home. I had absolutely no idea you were visiting California. If my staff had known you were coming, we would have prepared a proper, highly exclusive reception for you. Please come forward." Calvin gestured grandly toward the three billionaires who were still staring at Victor in stunned, uncomfortable silence. "We are just finalizing a very exciting round of exclusive funding, but there is always room at the table for Vanguard Holdings. We have been hoping to partner with your incredible organization for a very long time. Let me have my security escort this confused old man out of your way so we can talk real business in my private office right now." Victor did not look at Calvin's outstretched hand. He did not even acknowledge the desperate, pathetic greeting. Instead, he stepped out from the shadows, his tailored suit completely dry and immaculate, contrasting sharply with my soaked and ruined clothes. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a seasoned predator circling a severely wounded animal. Victor walked straight past Calvin, leaving the arrogant chief executive standing awkwardly with his hand suspended in the cold, empty air. He stopped directly in front of the polished mahogany table and looked down at the three heavy leather portfolios containing the fraudulent 15 million contracts. He reached out and slowly closed the cover of the nearest portfolio, his movements deliberate and incredibly precise. Then he turned his cold, calculating gaze back to Calvin. Without saying a single word, Victor reached out and firmly grasped the silver microphone that Calvin was still holding tightly in his left hand. For a brief, desperate second, Calvin tried to hold on, but Victor's grip was like solid iron. He effortlessly pulled the microphone away, completely stripping Calvin of his voice and his power in front of his elite guests. If you love seeing a narcissist get exactly what they deserve, hit the subscribe button right now. Trust me. The look of complete and utter devastation slowly creeping onto his face in this very moment was worth every single second of the terrible pain I had endured over the last 5 long years. Before I reveal what happened next, the moment that completely shattered that entire room, leave a quick comment with the number 88 below so I know you're still here with me in the story. And just a small note before we continue, some parts of the upcoming story include fictional elements added for reflection and storytelling. If that kind of narrative isn't for you, you're completely free to stop watching here. Victor tapped the top of the silver microphone once the sharp electronic sound echoing loudly through the dead, silent ballroom. The entire crowd of wealthy socialites and powerful tech elite leaned in, completely captivated by the intense drama unfolding right before their very eyes. Nobody dared to speak or even breathe too loudly. They could all sense that a massive execution was about to take place right in the middle of the extravagant 15 million mansion. The air was incredibly thick with raw tension heavy enough to cut with a knife. The lavish, wildly expensive birthday party had instantly transformed into a brutal courtroom, and Calvin was standing completely defenseless before the ultimate judge, completely unaware of the absolute magnitude of the terrifying storm that had finally arrived at his very doorstep. Victor turned his back on Calvin, dismissing him entirely, and looked directly at the 3 billionaire investors standing frozen at the table. He took a deep breath, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the massive room. "Gentlemen," Victor announced, his deep, commanding voice vibrating powerfully through the massive speakers of the grand foyer. "I strongly advise you to put your expensive pens away. Do not sign that contract." The sudden, forceful statement hit the quiet room like a physical shockwave. Calvin gasped loudly, stepping forward in blind, unthinking panic. His hands reaching out, as if he could somehow physically pull the damaging words back out of the cold air. He began to stammer desperately, trying to formulate a coherent sentence to save his crumbling empire. But his terrified mind completely failed him. He was completely trapped. Victor raised a single authoritative hand, silencing the broken man instantly, before he could even speak. The man who was holding this microphone just moments ago is a complete fraud. Victor continued, his tone absolutely ruthless, clinical, and unforgiving. He does not own this massive real estate empire. He has absolutely no legal authority to sell you a single share of corporate equity tonight. The true 80% majority shareholder of this entire corporation, the man who built it all from the very beginning, is standing right here. Victor turned and pointed at me. It is Mr. Franklin Doyle, the man you just threw out into the freezing rain. The gasp from the elite guests echoed like a thunderclap inside the foyer. The silence shattered into a wave of frantic whispers. The three billionaire investors immediately stepped away from the mahogany table. They looked at Calvin as if he had revealed a deadly disease. The gold pen remained on the table, the 15 million fraudulent contracts left unsigned. Calvin stood frozen, his styled hair sticking to his sweaty forehead. His eyes darted between the terrified investors, the Wall Street titan, and finally settling on me. The panic mutated into a desperate survival instinct. He threw his hands up, forcing a hollow laugh. "This is completely ridiculous!" Calvin stammered, his voice shaking violently as he tried to regain control. "Please, gentlemen, do not listen to this nonsense. Mr. Thorne is clearly the victim of a terrible misunderstanding." He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with frantic fear. "This old man is my father-in-law, and he is severely ill. He has been suffering from advanced dementia for over 3 years. His mind is gone. I took him into my home because he could no longer care for himself. He wanders around making up delusional fantasies about owning my company. He does not own anything. He is a sick, confused old man who needs immediate medical attention." Calvin looked desperately at his wealthy friends. "I built this empire from the ground up. Are you really going to let a crazy old mechanic ruin a 15 million partnership?" His lies were incredibly smooth, perfectly practiced, after years of deceiving everyone around him. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of doubt cross the face of the silver-haired investor. The lie was plausible to these people. It was easier to believe that an old man in a ruined suit simply lost his mind than to accept that their charming tech genius was actually a massive criminal. I knew I had to cut the head completely off the snake right in this exact moment. I walked slowly past the imposing wall of Victor Thorne's bodyguards. I did not rush. I took my time, allowing every person in the room to look closely at my face. I stopped in front of the polished mahogany table, standing mere inches away from the man who had stolen 5 years of my life. Victor Thorne caught my eye, gave an approving nod, and handed me the silver microphone. I wrapped my calloused fingers around the cool metal of the microphone. I took a deep breath, feeling the incredible weight of the moment settle onto my shoulders. When I spoke, my voice did not shake. It boomed through the high vaulted ceilings with the undeniable clarity of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "My name is Franklin Doyle," I said, looking directly into the eyes of the 3 billionaire investors. "And my mind is perfectly clear. 5 years ago, my son-in-law came to my modest home in Detroit. He was bankrupt, drowning in massive personal debt, and crying like a desperate child. He begged me to save his career. I sold my mechanic shop. I liquidated my retirement fund. I took exactly $500,000, every penny I had to my name, and I handed it over to him. Because he was terrified of his wife finding out, he made me place the money into a highly secure blind trust. The ballroom was silent again, hanging on to my every word. Because of the exact legal structure of that specific trust, I continued, my voice growing stronger with every syllable. Yeah, that $500,000 was used as the sole initial seed capital for this entire holding company. Calvin never bought me out. He simply hid the truth from me. That original investment compounded entirely, leaving me as the sole legal owner of exactly 80% of this entire corporate empire. Calvin gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. No, he whispered weakly, realizing that his hidden secrets were finally being dragged out into the bright light. Just 1 month ago, I said, turning my gaze slowly back to the crowd. He handed me a stack of routine medical insurance forms. He used my absolute trust in him as a weapon. Hidden right in the middle of those medical papers was a fraudulent equity waiver. He tricked me into signing away my 80% ownership stake so he could steal the entire company out from under my nose. He thought I was just a clueless, uneducated old man. He thought he could throw me out into the freezing rain tonight, finalize his legal theft by tomorrow morning, and wash his hands of me forever. I took a step closer to Calvin. He was visibly shaking his eyes, darting frantically toward the heavy front doors. But the worst part of his deception is why he invited all of you here tonight. I announced, pointing directly at the 3 horrified tech investors. You are not here to celebrate my daughter. You are here because Calvin Carrington currently owes exactly $10 million to a highly organized, incredibly dangerous Russian syndicate. He lost his capital at underground high-stakes poker tables. He brought you here tonight to trick you into signing those contracts so he could steal your $15 million, pay off the ruthless mob, and leave you holding an empty, debt-ridden shell. The crowd erupted into total chaos. The wealthy investors cursed loudly, grabbing their coats and rushing frantically away from the table. The brilliant illusion was shattered. Calvin fell to his knees, the last ounce of his strength completely leaving his body. I looked down at the pathetic, trembling man who had taken everything from me. I looked dead into his terrified, wide eyes, lifted the silver microphone to my mouth, and delivered the final, devastating blow. As majority shareholder, I am officially declaring this company bankrupt and liquidating all assets. You have nothing. The silence that followed my declaration lasted less than a heartbeat. Then the entire room erupted. The 3 billionaire investors didn't waste time asking questions. Men who had built fortunes on risk knew exactly how to recognize disaster when they saw it. They understood instinctively when a deal had turned poisonous, and when a ship was sinking. The silver-haired investor pushed his chair back so abruptly, it scraped loudly across the marble floor. The gold-plated pen he had been holding rolled across the polished mahogany table, coming to rest beside the fraudulent $15 million contract Calvin had just presented to them. He didn't bother picking it up. Instead, he gave a sharp hand signal toward the 2 large men standing discreetly near the wall, his security detail. Within seconds, the other 2 investors followed his lead. Chairs scraped back. Jackets were pulled tight. Phones disappeared into pockets as the 3 wealthy men moved quickly away from the table. Their calm masks were gone now. Instinct had taken over. The group pushed their way through the stunned crowd of party guests, ignoring confused questions and startled protests as they moved toward the front entrance. They didn't even glance back. Within moments, they were gone. And just like that, Calvin's final hope of survival walked straight out the front door. The ballroom buzzed with anxious whispers as the guests struggled to understand what had just happened. At the center of the chaos, Calvin Carrington remained on his knees. His expensive tuxedo pooled awkwardly around him on the marble floor, the once perfect lines of the suit now twisted and creased. His chest rose and fell in quick, desperate breaths as his hands clutched the sides of his head. He looked less like a powerful CEO and more like a man watching his entire world collapse around him. Then a sharp voice shattered the rising panic. "What is going on here, Ashley?" Her voice sliced through the ballroom like a blade. My daughter forced her way through the crowd of frightened socialites, pushing past guests who were still trying to process the unfolding disaster. Her glittering birthday gown swished angrily around her legs as she stormed into the center of the room. Her eyes locked onto me immediately, and they burned with fury. "Why are you still here?" she demanded, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceilings. "I told security to throw you out. You are ruining my party. You are embarrassing me." Calvin said nothing. He didn't even look up. He simply stared at the marble floor beneath him, as if the answer might somehow be written there. Ashley let out an impatient scoff. To her, this entire situation still looked like nothing more than a petty family conflict. She had no idea that the ground beneath her life had already collapsed. Reaching into her sparkling diamond-studded clutch, she pulled out her phone with an irritated flick of her wrist. "You don't own anything," she sneered at me. "Calvin is the CEO. Our company is worth tens of millions." Her voice dripped with arrogant certainty. "I'm calling my private bankers right now to end this nonsense." Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she opened her financial application. I said nothing. I simply watched and waited. It took less than 3 seconds. The smug expression vanished from her face so quickly, it looked almost unreal. Her lips parted as she stared down at the glowing screen in disbelief. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The pale light of the phone illuminated her face, revealing what she was seeing. Every account, every credit line, every joint investment. Zero. Frozen. Gone. Her hand began to tremble. We're broke," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted toward Calvin. "Calvin, all of our accounts are locked." Her breathing grew shallow as the truth finally forced its way into her mind. "We have nothing." But before Calvin could even attempt to respond, the atmosphere in the grand foyer shifted once again. And this time the change was far more dangerous than frozen bank accounts. The sound of the raging storm outside was pierced by the high-pitched wail of approaching sirens. The noise grew louder and more aggressive with every passing second, echoing ominously through the exclusive hills of Calabasas. The massive arched windows facing the circular driveway were bathed in a frantic strobing display of bright red and blue lights. The flashing colors cut violently through the heavy rain, casting terrifying shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. The remaining party guests, already deeply unsettled by the massive corporate scandal unraveling before them, now descended into total panic. Wealthy tech executives, famous socialites, and powerful politicians scrambled frantically toward the side exits, terrified of being photographed or legally associated with whatever massive criminal enterprise was about to be violently busted. They did not make it very far. The heavy oak front doors were suddenly thrown open with explosive, terrifying force. Over 24 federal agents swarmed into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots thundering against the delicate floors. They were wearing dark windbreakers with large, bold yellow letters spelling out Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs. They moved with absolute, highly coordinated precision, instantly securing every single exit and blocking anyone from leaving the 15 million estate. The lead agent, an imposing man with a stern expression and a thick folder in his hand, stepped directly into the center of the chaotic room. He raised his badge high into the air, his booming voice cutting effortlessly through the panicked screams of the elite guests. "Nobody moves!" the federal agent shouted with undeniable authority. "This entire property is officially on lockdown. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering." Victor Thorne stood quietly in the shadows beside me, a faint, satisfied smile playing across his lips. His elite forensic team, had not just traced Calvin's illegal syndicate debts. They had handed a perfectly packaged dossier of financial crimes directly to the federal authorities. The terrifying reality of federal prison finally crashed down onto Calvin's shoulders. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting frantically, as agents began forcefully confiscating computers and financial records from his terrified staff. His frantic mind rapidly calculated his extremely narrow odds of survival. He knew the massive digital freeze would undoubtedly raise red flags, but he desperately needed his defense attorneys to argue that the fraudulent medical waiver was the only valid transfer of corporate equity. For that terrible lie to actually work in a federal court, he had to make absolutely sure that the authentic trust document was completely and permanently destroyed forever. And the only physical way to access that damning original document was sitting inside a small, splintered oak box somewhere out in the freezing mud. Calvin suddenly grabbed the collar of his terrified head butler, violently shaking the poor, confused man. "Find the old man's wooden box!" Calvin screamed hysterically, his voice raw and broken completely, ignoring the armed federal agents aggressively closing in on his position. "I do not care what it costs or what it takes. Go out into the trash. Dig through the freezing mud with your bare hands. Find it." The terrified butler trembled violently in Calvin's aggressive grip, utterly paralyzed by the sudden eruption of madness from his employer. The poor man stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavily armed federal agents who were rapidly advancing across the grand foyer. Before the butler could even attempt to form a coherent response, two large federal agents forcefully intervened. They grabbed Calvin by the shoulders, prying his frantic hands off the frightened staff member, and shoved the disgraced chief executive back with undeniable authority. "Stand down and keep your hands where we can see them." The lead agent commanded, his voice echoing like a crack of thunder in the tense room. Calvin stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His expensive custom tuxedo was now deeply disheveled, the crisp collar bent, and his perfectly styled hair hung in messy strands across his pale, sweating forehead. He ignored the federal agents entirely, his wild, bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the crowd, the massive oak doors, and the arched windows, desperately calculating the impossible logistics of finding a tiny wooden box in the middle of a torrential rainstorm. The sheer desperation radiating from him was a pathetic sight to behold. This was the brilliant tech visionary, the untouchable master of a real estate empire, completely reduced to a frantic, broken animal, searching for scraps of garbage to save his life. The heavy silence that suddenly fell over the remaining party guests and the federal agents was thick with anticipation. Everyone watched the spectacular meltdown of Calvin Carrington, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of stolen money. I stood there in my wet, ruined clothes, feeling the heavy gaze of the room slowly shift back to me. The burning anger that had propelled me through the storm and past his security guards had now settled into a deep, unshakable calm. I looked at the man who had stolen my life savings, the man who had ordered me thrown out into the freezing mud like a worthless stray dog. I watched him mentally unravel, knowing exactly what he was searching for, and knowing perfectly well that he would never ever find it out there in the dark. "Are you looking for this, Calvin?" I asked. My voice was not loud, but in the dead silence of the grand foyer it carried with absolute, undeniable clarity. Calvin froze. His frantic movement stopped instantly. He slowly turned his head, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto mine. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath as I slowly reached my right hand into the deep pocket of my soaked, wine-stained suit jacket. I could feel the cold, damp fabric clinging to my skin. My fingers brushed against the rough, jagged edges of splintered wood, and then the smooth, cold surface of polished metal. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket and raised it up for the entire room to see. Resting directly in the center of my calloused palm were the muddy, broken remains of the small oak box I had spent 3 entire months carefully carving. The beautiful craftsmanship had been completely destroyed, crushed beneath the careless heel of his wealthy party guests, and soaked in the filthy puddles of his massive driveway. But resting perfectly unharmed on top of the ruined muddy wood was the single object Calvin desperately needed to survive. It was a highly specialized, custom-milled titanium key. Even under the warm, ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers, the cold metal seemed to absorb the light, shining with a heavy, undeniable authority. "I found it outside in the freezing mud on my way back in," I said, keeping my voice steady and perfectly even. "I saw your groundskeepers preparing to sweep it into the industrial incinerator. You ordered your security to throw my gift away, Calvin. You called it trash. You stood right there and let your wife humiliate me, letting her kick this box away because it was not wrapped in expensive designer paper. You threw away the only thing that could have possibly saved you." Calvin stared at the shining titanium key, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. His eyes were wide with a horrifying realization that completely shattered his fragile mind. "Do you know what this key opens?" I asked, taking one slow, deliberate step closer to him. "This key belongs to a highly secure private safety deposit box, located in a subterranean vault in downtown Los Angeles. And inside that specific steel box sits the original, unaltered master trust document from exactly 5 years ago. It is the document featuring our wet ink signatures. It is the undeniable physical proof that the medical waiver you tricked me into signing last month is an absolute malicious forgery. Without this key, you could have lied to the federal judges. You could have claimed the digital freeze was a terrible mistake. You could have walked away with your stolen millions and left me to die in poverty. But with this key, the federal prosecutors have the exact physical evidence they need to put you in a maximum security prison for the rest of your miserable life." The crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake finally landed squarely on his shoulders. The brilliant, arrogant chief executive realized that his ultimate downfall was not caused by a brilliant corporate rival or a sudden market crash. His total destruction was caused entirely by his own cruel, unyielding arrogance. He had literally ordered his staff to throw his only salvation directly into the garbage. The psychological collapse was absolute and immediate. Calvin's legs simply gave out from underneath him. He collapsed forward, his knees slamming hard against the imported Italian marble floor. The sharp sound echoed through the silent room. 5,000 custom Italian tuxedo pooled around him, soaking up the wet, muddy footprints left behind by the federal agents. He did not care about his appearance anymore. He did not care about the wealthy socialites watching him or the armed agents standing just a few feet away. He looked up at me, his face completely contorted in raw, unfiltered agony. Hot tears began to stream rapidly down his pale cheeks, mixing with the heavy layer of sweat on his forehead. He raised his trembling hands, clasping them together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of prayer. "Please, Franklin!" Calvin sobbed hysterically, his voice cracking into a high, pitiful whine. "Please, I am begging you. Do not do this to me. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I will give you everything back. I will sign the company over to you right now. I will walk away with nothing. Just please, please give me the key. You cannot let them take me to prison. I will not survive in there. You are a good man, Franklin. You are family. Please save me." Calvin's pathetic, broken pleas hung in the stagnant air of the grand foyer, echoing against the imported Italian marble walls. He remained on his knees, his hands clasped together in a desperate posture of prayer, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face. The federal agents surrounding him did not show a single ounce of sympathy. They had seen countless arrogant, wealthy criminals collapse just like this, when the terrifying reality of federal prison finally caught up to them. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had systematically destroyed my life for the past 5 years. I felt absolutely nothing for him, No pity, no anger, just a profound, hollow emptiness. But before I could even open my mouth to respond to his pathetic begging, a sudden blur of motion caught the corner of my eye. It was Ashley. My daughter had been standing off to the side, completely frozen in a state of absolute shock, ever since she saw the zero balance on her banking application. But as she watched Calvin groveling on the floor, weeping and frantically offering to surrender the entire corporate empire, a dark, calculating survival instinct violently snapped awake inside her mind. She realized with sudden absolute clarity that the sinking ship was completely submerged, and Calvin was an anchor securely tied around her neck. Without a single moment of hesitation, she marched aggressively across the wet, muddy floor in her custom designer birthday gown. She stopped right next to her sobbing husband, drew back her expensive high-heeled shoe, and viciously kicked him squarely in the ribs. Calvin gasped in pain, falling sideways onto the hard marble floor and clutching his side. Ashley stood over him, her face completely twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You disgusting monster!" She screamed, her shrill voice cutting violently through the heavy silence of the room. "You lied to me. You completely ruined my life. You told me you were a brilliant entrepreneur. You told me you built this entire company from scratch. I cannot believe I ever married such a pathetic, lying thief. You stole from my own father. You stole from my family to pay for your disgusting gambling habits. I hate you. I never want to see your face again." She spat the words out with such venomous hatred that even the seasoned federal agents took a small, cautious step backward. She was putting on a truly spectacular theatrical performance for the entire room, desperately trying to publicly sever all legal and emotional ties to the sinking chief executive. She wanted the wealthy investors, the socialites, and most importantly, the federal authorities to see her purely as a tragically deceived victim. Once she felt she had properly established her absolute disgust for Calvin, she executed a terrifyingly fast emotional pivot. The vicious, aggressive anger completely vanished from her beautiful face, instantly replaced by a look of profound, innocent devastation. She turned away from her groaning husband and rushed directly toward me. She did not care about the mud or the freezing rainwater dripping from my ruined suit. She threw herself forward, falling to her knees right in front of me, and tightly grabbing the lapels of my cheap wine-stained jacket. Heavy, dramatic tears began to pour rapidly from her wide eyes, streaming down her perfectly applied makeup. "Daddy!" she cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. "Daddy, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea. I swear to you on my life I did not know anything about his massive debts or the blind trust. He hid everything from me. He kept me completely in the dark." She sobbed loudly, resting her forehead against my wet chest, her hands gripping my coat, as if she were a frightened child waking up from a terrible nightmare. "I thought the money was completely lost in the market crash, just like he told you." She continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "He completely controlled all the bank accounts. He controlled every single aspect of our lives. He became so abusive and manipulative. He forced me to say those terrible things to you tonight. He told me that if I did not kick you out of the party and publicly humiliate you, he would freeze my credit cards and throw me out onto the street. I was so terrified of him, Daddy. I only slapped you because he made me do it. It was all him. Please, you have to believe me. Please protect me. I am your little girl." I stood there like a statue, listening to her desperate, frantic lies. 40 years of fatherhood flashed quickly through my tired mind. I remembered holding her when she was just a baby. I remembered working double shifts at the hot, greasy mechanic shop just to pay for her expensive ballet lessons and her out-of-state college tuition. I remembered walking her down the aisle, believing I was handing my precious daughter over to a man who would love and protect her. For a very long time, I would have done absolutely anything to keep her safe. If she had come to me crying like this just 1 month ago, my heart would have completely shattered, and I would have moved mountains to shield her from the painful consequences of the world. But as I looked down at her now, desperately clinging to my ruined clothes and spinning a web of completely pathetic lies, my heart remained entirely cold. The painful, devastating truth was right in front of my eyes. The sweet, innocent daughter I had loved and sacrificed everything for had died a very long time ago. The woman sobbing at my feet was nothing more than a greedy, hollow shell, a deeply selfish parasite who only cared about her luxurious lifestyle. Completely willing to throw her own husband into the fire the very second the money disappeared. She did not love me. She only loved the massive financial power I suddenly held in my hands. I slowly reached down and grabbed her wrists. My grip was incredibly firm, completely lacking any parental warmth or gentle affection. I forcefully peeled her manicured hands off my wet jacket and took a slow, deliberate step backward, completely severing the physical connection between us. The fake tears instantly stopped flowing. She looked up at me, her wide eyes flashing with a sudden genuine spike of pure panic, as she realized her theatrical performance was completely failing to move me. I looked down at her with absolute zero emotion, my voice sounding like cracking ice in the quiet, tense room. "Are you sure about that, Ashley?" I asked coldly. "And are you absolutely sure you had no idea?" Before she could desperately formulate another frantic lie to save herself, Victor Thorne stepped smoothly out of the dark shadows directly behind me. The powerful Wall Street billionaire did not say a single word. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate custom-tailored suit and slowly pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. Victor held the small silver device between his thumb and forefinger, presenting it to me like a loaded weapon. The red recording light on the top of the device blinked steadily, a tiny beacon of absolute truth in a room completely suffocated by lies. Ashley stared at the digital recorder, her perfectly manicured hands slowly dropping away from the wet fabric of my suit jacket. Her tear-stained face contorted in sudden, genuine confusion. She had spent her entire life believing she was the smartest person in any given room, completely convinced that her manipulative charm could easily erase any terrible mistake. But as I took the sleek audio recorder from Victor's outstretched hand, I watched the absolute certainty completely drain from her wide eyes. Vanguard Holdings does not just conduct standard financial audits when they prepare to acquire a multi-million-dollar corporate empire, I explained softly, looking down at my kneeling daughter. They employ former intelligence officers. They monitor private servers, intercept encrypted emails, and carefully record cellular communications to ensure they are not buying a criminal enterprise. They captured hundreds of hours of your private phone calls, Ashley. I held the digital device up high so the entire room could clearly see it. The armed federal agents stood perfectly still, their hands resting cautiously on their dark tactical belts, completely captivated by the unfolding family drama. Even Calvin paused his pathetic, hysterical sobbing, slowly lifting his heavy head from the cold marble floor to stare at the small silver machine. The ambient noise in the grand foyer dropped to an absolute dead silence. I did not hesitate for another second. I firmly pressed the play button on the side of the device. A brief hiss of digital static filled the expansive room instantly, followed by the crystal-clear audio of a telephone conversation. It was a recorded call from exactly 2 days ago, and the voice echoing powerfully through the massive acoustics of the luxury mansion did not belong to Calvin. It belonged entirely to the woman currently kneeling right at my feet. The arrogant, highly impatient tone of my daughter's recorded voice sliced through the heavy tension of the room like a sharpened butcher knife. She sounded completely bored, casually discussing my terrible fate, while undoubtedly sitting in a luxury salon or a high-end retail store. Just make the old idiot sign the medical papers. Ashley's recorded voice sneered with unimaginable cruelty. The sheer venom in her tone was entirely unrecognizable from the weeping, innocent victim she had just pretended to be moments ago. Though once we get him declared incompetent and lock him in a nursing home, we get the 80%. And I never have to look at his ugly face again. The recording captured a short, dismissive laugh, a sound so entirely devoid of basic human empathy that it sent a violent chill right down my spine. Then the intercepted call abruptly ended. The sharp digital click of the device turning off echoed loudly in the quiet room. The devastating impact of her own words was immediate and absolute. The carefully constructed illusion of her innocence shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the federal authorities. Ashley completely froze in place, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated shock. The fake theatrical tears on her pale cheeks dried instantly, replaced by the terrifying realization that she had just been publicly exposed as the true architect of my misery. She had known absolutely everything from the very beginning. She had actively planned my total destruction with cold, calculated precision. She genuinely wanted me locked away in a secure psychiatric ward so she could freely spend the millions of dollars I had sacrificed my entire life to build. The federal investigators exchanged grim, knowing looks with one another. They had dealt with countless ruthless corporate conspirators, and Ashley had just provided them with absolute, undeniable proof of her active participation in a massive federal fraud. Calvin looked up at his wife from his humiliating position on the cold floor. He finally realized she had just viciously kicked him and abandoned him to save herself, only to be immediately exposed as an equal partner in the terrible crime. The mutual hatred passing violently between the married couple was a truly pathetic sight to witness. I looked at the two of them, the greedy daughter and the arrogant son-in-law, entirely ruined by their own relentless ambition and profound selfishness. The heavy weight of the last 5 years finally lifted completely off my tired shoulders. I was no longer a victim trapped in their dark basement. I was the absolute master of my own destiny once again, holding all of the remaining cards. I turned slightly and reached toward a nearby silver tray, resting elegantly on the polished mahogany table. One of the fleeing tech investors had left a half-full crystal glass of vintage red wine sitting behind. I picked up the heavy crystal glass with my left hand. In my right hand, I firmly held the shining titanium vault key, the only physical object standing between them and a maximum security federal prison. I slowly held the metal key directly over the wide rim of the crystal glass. Calvin gasped loudly, violently, reaching his trembling hands forward in a desperate final attempt to stop me, but the armed agents immediately forced him back down against the hard floor. Without breaking my cold, steady gaze, I opened my fingers. The custom-milled titanium key dropped heavily into the dark red wine with a soft splash, sinking straight to the very bottom of the expensive glass. Ashley finally found her voice, letting out a sharp, hysterical scream of pure panic. But it was far too late for apologies. I drew my arm back and violently threw the dark liquid directly into both of their terrified faces. The room watched in absolute stunned silence as the final act of vengeance concluded. "Happy birthday?" The dark red wine dripped slowly from Calvin's face, staining his crisp white shirt and mixing with his tears. He let out a pathetic wail that sounded like a dying animal. The federal agents did not give him a single moment to wipe his eyes or compose himself. The lead agent stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the marble floor, and aggressively grabbed Calvin by the collar of his ruined custom tuxedo. With a swift, practiced motion, the agent forcefully spun Calvin around and slammed him face first against the polished mahogany table where the fraudulent 15 million contracts still sat. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Calvin's wrists echoed through the grand foyer. It was the absolute sound of total finality. Calvin began to thrash wildly against the heavy wooden table, screaming hysterically about his innocence, about terrible misunderstandings, and about his powerful lawyers. But his frantic words fell on completely deaf ears. Two massive federal agents simply grabbed him by the arms and dragged his thrashing body backward. His expensive Italian shoes scraped loudly across the imported marble floors as they pulled him toward the massive front doors. He kicked and screamed, begging the remaining party guests for help, but the wealthy elite simply turned their heads away in disgust. They threw him out into the violent storm, shoving him roughly into the back of a waiting armored federal transport vehicle. As Calvin was taken away, another group of official-looking individuals walked through the entrance. They were not federal agents. They were elite representatives from the Federal Banking Commission and the primary lending institutions, completely flanked by their own private security personnel. They moved with clinical efficiency, entirely ignoring the luxurious surroundings and the terrified socialites who were still desperately trying to gather their coats and flee the premises. One senior bank representative walked directly over to the main interior wall, pulling a thick roll of red federal seizure tape from his heavy briefcase. He began aggressively taping bright, highly visible foreclosure notices directly onto the beautiful hand-painted wallpaper and the massive marble pillars. 15 million estate was no longer a symbol of incredible wealth and elite social status. It had instantly become an active federal crime scene and a seized government asset. The absolute speed at which Calvin's entire fraudulent empire was being systematically dismantled was truly breathtaking to witness. Everything he had stolen, everything he had lied and manipulated to acquire, was being legally stripped away from him in a matter of minutes. Ashley simply stood frozen amidst the chaotic flurry of federal activity. The dark red wine I had thrown in her face was still dripping from her chin, staining the delicate, expensive fabric of her custom designer birthday gown. She looked around the grand foyer with wide, completely vacant eyes, unable to process the total destruction of her perfect, heavily curated reality. A female federal agent approached her with a stern, completely uncompromising expression. "You need to vacate the premises immediately, ma'am," the agent commanded, firmly pointing directly toward the open front doors. "This entire property, including all physical contents, vehicles, and personal belongings inside, has been officially seized by the United States federal government, pending a massive criminal investigation. You are legally trespassing." Ashley gasped, her hands flying to her stained chest in absolute horror. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "I live here. All of my clothes, my expensive jewelry, my life is in this house. You cannot just throw me out into the street." The federal agent did not flinch or offer a single ounce of sympathy. "You have 2 minutes to walk out that door voluntarily," the agent stated coldly, "or you will be placed in handcuffs and physically removed for obstructing a federal seizure operation." Ashley desperately looked toward me, her tear-filled eyes silently begging for a sudden miraculous rescue. But I simply turned my back on her and began walking slowly toward the front entrance. I stepped out through the heavy oak doors, leaving the chaotic, flashing lights of the grand foyer entirely behind me. The freezing rain was still pouring down in thick, relentless sheets. I walked down the stone steps and across the muddy driveway, making my way back to the midnight black Bentley, where Victor Thorne was already waiting for me. I climbed into the warm, luxurious cabin, sinking deeply into the pristine leather seat. A few moments later, I looked out through the rain-streaked tinted window. 2 federal agents had grabbed my daughter by the arms and forcefully escorted her out of the mansion. They pushed her down the wet stone steps and left her standing alone in the massive circular driveway. She was wearing nothing but her thin, soaking wet birthday dress. The freezing rain plastered her hair to her face, washing away her expensive makeup. She wrapped her bare arms tightly around her shivering body, completely surrounded by crushed flowers, deep mud, and the bright, terrifying flashing lights of the police cruisers. She was standing in the exact same spot, where she had violently thrown me away like garbage just 1 hour ago. The poetic justice of the terrifying moment was completely undeniable. She looked completely pathetic, shivering violently in the terrible cold, finally experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality she had so casually inflicted upon her own father. She slowly looked up through the heavy, relentless rain and met my eyes through the thick, tinted glass of the luxury vehicle. She opened her mouth desperately, crying out my name, begging for one final chance at forgiveness. But the time for terrible lies and fake tears was entirely over. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or regret. I calmly raised my right hand and pressed the silver button on the door panel. The thick glass window slowly rolled all the way up, completely silencing her desperate, screaming voice forever. As the massive, luxurious, midnight black Bentley pulled away from the chaotic, heavily guarded crime scene, I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and closed my tired eyes. The heavy, relentless rain that had battered the city all evening was finally beginning to slow down, turning into a very soft, gentle drizzle against the thick windshield. I listened to the smooth, quiet hum of the powerful engine, feeling a profound, completely unbreakable sense of peace settle deeply into my weary, aging bones. Victor Thorne sat quietly across from me respectfully, giving me the time and the space I needed to fully process the absolute magnitude of the incredible events that had just occurred tonight. I slowly opened my eyes and looked out the side window one last time. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers faded away into the dark, winding roads of the exclusive Calabasas Hills. I was leaving that 15 million mansion and the extremely toxic people inside it firmly in the rearview mirror of my life. I never looked back again, completely closing that dark chapter of my life forever. The aftermath of that explosive night was swift and incredibly brutal. The federal authorities tore through Calvin Carrington's fraudulent real estate empire with surgical precision. Because I had successfully provided the original trust document and the intercepted audio recordings, the skilled prosecutors had an absolute airtight case. Calvin pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud and international money laundering, desperately trying to significantly reduce his lengthy sentence. But the federal judge showed him absolutely no mercy. He was sentenced to 20 long years in a maximum security prison, completely stripped of his expensive custom suits and his arrogant charm. As for the dangerous Russian syndicate, he owed 10 million. The federal seizure of his assets completely cut off his ability to pay them back. He is currently sitting in a small concrete cell, constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of the specific day he eventually gets released. My daughter Ashley walked away from the massive wreckage with absolutely nothing to her name. Because the federal government permanently seized all the assets purchased with stolen corporate funds, she was completely evicted and strictly forced to surrender her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her extravagant jewelry. She tried to desperately reach out to me several times during the lengthy legal proceedings, sending long, tearful letters begging for immediate financial support and a safe place to stay. I simply returned every single letter completely unopened. She had deliberately made her terrible bed of lies and cruelty, and now she was forcefully compelled to sleep in it alone. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy her love and protect her from the harsh world, but I finally realized that the absolute best thing I could ever do for her was to let her face the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own terribly selfish actions. I did not attempt to somehow salvage Calvin's completely corrupted company. The toxic foundation it was built upon was simply far too deeply compromised. I allowed the federal courts to legally liquidate the massive real estate empire, letting the fraudulent enterprise burn completely to the ground. However, before the total collapse of the complex corporate structure, Victor Thorne and his brilliant team of Wall Street lawyers quickly stepped in to aggressively represent my specific legal interests. Because I was the legally documented defrauded primary equity holder, Vanguard Holdings successfully negotiated the clean extraction of my initial investment capital before the massive federal asset forfeiture was entirely finalized. The final financial settlement was an incredible, entirely unexpected blessing. I did not just recover my original $500,000. Through the careful legal liquidation of the clean corporate assets, I walked away with my initial investment plus compounded market interest, completely totaling exactly $5 million in cash. It was a truly staggering amount of money, considerably more wealth than a retired mechanic from Detroit could ever possibly spend in a single quiet lifetime. But I absolutely did not keep it to personally fund a lavish, extravagant lifestyle. I had clearly seen firsthand what obsessive greed and unchecked luxury could permanently do to a fragile human soul, and I strictly refused to let that dark poison infect the final peaceful years of my life. Instead, I moved back to my quiet hometown and used the money to create a massive philanthropic foundation. I established a specialized grant program entirely dedicated to helping struggling, hard-working, blue-collar mechanics. We provide vital financial assistance to older tradesmen who need help with massive medical bills, and we offer generous scholarships to young men and women who want to open their very own independent auto repair shops. I spend my days surrounded by honest, calloused hands and the familiar, comforting smell of motor oil. And to you listening to this story, remember this. Sometimes the hardest truth in life is learning that not everyone who shares your blood truly deserves your heart. I once believed that family meant endless sacrifice. I believed love meant giving everything even when it slowly destroyed me. But life and God taught me something deeper. God sees what happens in silence. God sees the sacrifices we make. And in His time, God reveals the truth that people try to hide. If my story has any value, let it be this: do not make the same mistake I did. Do not ignore the warning signs just because someone is family. Respect yourself. Protect your dignity. Even in many grandpa stories, the old man learns too late that kindness without boundaries can be dangerous. This family story is not about revenge. It is about awakening. Many grandpa stories carry the same quiet lesson: work hard, love honestly, but never allow others to treat your goodness as weakness. And if this family story teaches anything, it is that loyalty must be mutual. From my heart, I believe a peaceful life is worth far more than a luxurious one built on lies. Among the mechanics I now help, I have found more honesty than in any mansion. In the end, the people who respect hard work and humility become your real family. That is why many grandpa stories and every true family story remind us that character matters more than wealth. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to walk away from someone toxic, even if they were family? Your story might help someone else. And if you enjoy meaningful family story content and reflective grandpa stories, consider sharing this video or subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. Thank you sincerely for staying with me until the very end. And a small note: some of the stories you hear next may include fictional elements created for reflection and learning. If that kind of storytelling isn't for you, feel free to choose other content that better suits you.